Thanks everyone for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've come to a few of these workshops, and it's really important for me to be here talking about what we're doing here in Australia, there in Australia. And a few of the things I'm talking about have either been learnt or inspired by people within this room and things I've learned from this workshop from previous years. So thank you for having me. I have some disclosures, and one main disclosure is I have flown from Milan down under, a very long way away, a very long Friday for me, but I'm actually Malaysian, but I do live and work in Australia. We have a population of 26 million, just for some context for you guys in the room and online. So less than a tenth of the population of the United States. And I looked this up. We actually, I always thought America was a lot more bigger than Australia, but it's not. We're a similar size, so we have a small population and a big land mass, and the majority of our population is concentrated in what we call the capital cities of each state and territory, all around the coastal areas, because Australia is this big, beautiful, but harsh desert in the centre. So our populations of people are densely concentrated around these coastal capital cities, and similarly, people with HIV are concentrated in these areas. In particular, Melbourne, where I'm from at the bottom, and Sydney, who everyone knows, I think, Sydney when we think of Australia. Another point I wanted to make is we're a very diverse country, so over 50% of Australians in our most recent census were either born overseas or have a parent who was born overseas. So very diverse migrant country. A bit of context of HIV in Australia, so less than 30,000 people with HIV in the country. We have a universal healthcare system, which is great if you are a citizen or permanent resident. So it's not so great if you're an international student who are required to purchase insurance to ensure their healthcare needs are covered in the case of any kind of emergency or care needs. We have subsidized antiretroviral therapy regardless of visa status, though, regardless of our universal healthcare system is called Medicare. So regardless of Medicare, antiretroviral therapy is either free or heavily subsidized, irrespective of visa status. And this is something that only changed last year. Prior to that, we had to apply usually to the companies for compassionate access for medications, or people would even import their drugs. But this has been a recent and welcome change by our government that free ART is available irrespective of visa status. Prescribing is done mainly through our HIV clinics in tertiary hospitals. We also have primary care prescribers known as S100 prescribers. They do a 6-month course to be given prescribing rights for antiretroviral therapy, and we also have very busy sexual health clinics around the country. Bit of demographics for our population. This is data from people most recently diagnosed in 2022, I believe. Nearly 70% identified as gay and bisexual men who have sex with men, and of our newly notified or new diagnoses, 27% identified their exposure as being heterosexual contact. Only 1.6% of people who inject drugs, and we had 0 cases of vertical transmission in the year 21-22. And of interest for us in Australia, our Indigenous people are known as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, and 3% of the new notifications were in this population. And this is a real challenge for us because these people don't tend to live in these concentrated urban regions, the map I showed you previously. So it's an area that we need to target in terms of new diagnosis, essentially. So we have pretty small numbers, I guess, 552 new diagnoses in 2021, and a reduction of 37% since 2016. And this has really been in the advent of PrEP, which was put on our pharmaceutical benefit scheme in 2018. We have apparently the highest per capita population of people on HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis. So I think this reflects some of these numbers where we are doing relatively well. So our 95 targets look, I think, relatively good, I would say. And this 9% of people who have HIV who we don't know and haven't diagnosed yet is our real challenge. And I think that's not what I'm talking about today, so I won't go into too much detail into this, but you can see that reflected reduction in notifications over the last few years. This big dip following introduction of subsidized PrEP. In fact, this was announced last year at the IAS conference in Brisbane, if any of you were there. It's a nice soundbite, I think, virtual elimination of HIV in this tiny corridor of Sydney, but it's not relevant for the whole country and certainly not relevant for our global needs to eliminate new HIV infections. And obviously, there still is a great need for a cure, which is what I'm here to speak about today. So we've been quite active in the cure space in Australia. This is a website run in conjunction with my institute, the Doherty Institute, and NAPWA, which is the National Association of People with HIV in Australia. We have a long-standing history of great collaborations with community organisations, and this website has been running for almost 10 years, aimed at providing science and information about cure research and cure trials to a community audience. And it is developed and run in collaboration with NAPWA. We have, I'm not going to speak a long time about the clinical trials that we're running, and I'm going to speak a bit Melbourne-centric about these clinical trials because that's where I live and work, and it really is where the majority of clinical trials in HIV cure are occurring in Australia at the moment. We are doing a number of observational clinical trials, collecting blood samples, tissue samples, large volumes of white blood cells in the process known as leukapheresis, so a number of what we call observational clinical trials, and then interventional clinical trials where we're giving an intervention or drug to test and see what happens. So NEVO-LV is one of those. We're running this at the moment in Melbourne, and I'll refer to this a bit more in this talk, so I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about it. It's a low-dose immunotherapy, a cancer drug used extremely successfully in kidney cancers, lung cancers, and skin cancers. And we're looking at this in a cohort of people with HIV who do not have cancer, so well on treatment, and it's a dose escalation study to see efficacy as well as immunogenicity, so what's happening to HIV-specific immune responses after a single low dose of immunotherapy. This is much, much lower doses than what's used in cancer therapy. This study does involve a treatment interruption, and I'll speak a bit more on that later. And I know Karine will be speaking about this as well, so I won't go into a lot of detail about treatment interruptions, but this study involves one. Coming in Melbourne and Australia soon as well is a study called AMBER. This is in collaboration with our good friend Thomas Rasmussen, Aarhus University Hospital in Denmark. Venetoclax is another cancer drug. It's a pro-apoptotic drug, essentially. So cancer cells have this ability to evade death mechanisms, or mechanisms where cells would normally die. And this is also seen in HIV-infected cells. And this drug inhibits that process. So it's an inhibitor of avoidance of cell death, if that makes sense. So this is a study that is coming in Melbourne. The drug Venetoclax was actually developed at the institution of the time, so it's coming full circle. And we're looking at this drug in, once again, people with HIV who do not have cancer. And there's no treatment interruption in this study, but we're doing a dose escalation to see the impacts mainly on HIV-specific immune responses in relation to this drug. And MTD in this figure stands for maximum tolerated dose, so it's a big safety component to this study as well. Finally, PEACH is another immunomodulated drug, so looking at another cancer therapy. Pomalidomide, this is used in Kaposi sarcoma and multiple myeloma, and it's a drug that does improve or impact HIV's immune responses against cancer. The same process we think will work in HIV as well. Once again, this is done in collaboration with our colleagues in Denmark, and this is involving a treatment interruption and aim to recruit people towards the second half of the year. My point of going through these kind of complex studies is to show that we've got a lot happening and a big pipeline of cure trials coming. They're small numbers. We're looking at kind of less than 50 in each trial, but we are a small population of people with HIV, and we are very mindful of the fact that we have more people who come and volunteer time and time again for these trials, and we do need to think about how we can have, I think our next slide, sustainable recruitment and engagement of people with HIV in Australia in cure research. So this is what I'll spend the bulk of my talk talking about. Richard or Jeff, please wave if I'm going too long. Not sure how long. for this. So this is work I've done quite a while ago now, looking at perceptions and attitudes of people with HIV, but also HIV clinicians. We did a survey a while ago looking at asking what are concerns and preferences around treatment interruptions, and not surprisingly, over 40% of both of these groups expressed a great concern about the risk of transmitting HIV during the treatment interruption. And this next slide probably reflects that quite well, that when we asked how long would you be comfortable having a detectable virus level during a treatment interruption in the context of a HIV cure trial, and over 30% of the people with HIV who were surveyed said they wouldn't accept any duration, wants to be undetectable throughout. And I think we know that the end point for many cure trials at the moment is time to virus rebound, so kind of expecting virus rebound. And this clearly shows a disconnect between what is being understood by people that we surveyed, at least in terms of treatment interruptions, and what community hope for or expect, and also what is actually being done when we design these trials and how we conduct them. So how can we address this kind of this block, I guess? One is educate. I'm not going to talk about educating our clinicians, which is a whole side effort that we're working on, but that's a really important thing, but not what I'm talking about today. We need to understand what these barriers are to the people that we want to ask to volunteer for these trials, and we need to engage our community. So what are we doing in Australia to do this? I'll start by talking about the Melbourne HIV Cure Consortium. This funding was, I think it was opportunistic. It was applied for after Australia held the last World AIDS Conference. So last year was IAS in Brisbane, but in 2014 we had a World AIDS Conference in Melbourne. And off the back of that, some funding was requested from the Victoria, so the state of Victoria, where Melbourne is based, state government, and 1.2 billion Australian dollars was granted at that point. Through this consortium of research institutions and clinical institutions. They're all listed at the bottom of the slide, and I won't go through them. But the CURE Consortium brings together experts in virology, immunology, drug development, neuroscience, and social research, all with the aim to accelerate cure research in Melbourne. And with that money, we distributed small and large grants, and I'll give you some examples of a few of the projects that were funded by the MHCC, as well as supported our community advisory board, which is I'll speak about in the next few slides as well. And the MHCC also holds events. This was a very successful one we had at the end of 2022, which was where we invited grant recipients to talk about their studies and their outcomes, the results, the impacts, specifically aimed at a community audience. And that was challenging, as we know, to get scientists and clinicians to talk about their research to a lay audience in 5 minutes, which they all went over. They tried. Research. Science for community. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if this can, I don't know if I'll make it worse by moving it. HIV cure research, science for community. So this was, we had visiting keynote speaker Françoise Vares-Inessé, who we know won a Nobel Prize for finding, discovering HIV, and also my boss, Sharon Lewin. And this was well attended. It was online, it was freely available, it was free lunch, and it was a real effort that we put in to try and educate our researchers as well, to speak to a plain language audience and cut jargon and actually say, what is the impact of your work, even if it was the basic as the basic science, what is the impact on the community who we're doing this research for? This is our community advisory board, which was repopulated after the pandemic. So unfortunately, activities with our CAB really died away during COVID. I think resources were just spread everywhere. So we repopulated our CAB, and these are representatives from our peak community bodies within our state of Victoria, including Living Positive Victoria, Positive Women Victoria, and Thorn Harbour Health, which is previously the Victorian AIDS Council. This is our CAB with Françoise. Kareem, you're on this slide. This is an old workshop now, but this is one of the projects funded by the NHCC. So we received a small grant to run this workshop, and that grant essentially paid for Kareem and Tony Young to come over to visit us in Melbourne in 2019. And we ran this really fun workshop. I really enjoyed it, and hopefully Korean agrees. But it was a half-day workshop. We brought together anyone who wanted to come, but it was mainly the invite went out to people either with HIV, community activists, advocates, HIV cure researchers, clinicians, and scientists as well. So we brought them together, and the Melbourne HIV research community is pretty small, so we all knew each other. We gave each person a specific role within this workshop. And we ran a simulation exercise where we went through the stages of a clinical trial, all the way from scientific questioning, protocol development, recruitment, doing the research, follow-up, and presentation of results and dissemination of results. And we asked each individual at this workshop to think about how we can improve community engagement at each step of the clinical trial process. And we gave each participant a specific role. So the president of Living Positive Victoria, we gave him the role of lab head, Sharon Lewin, basically. And then my colleague, James McMahon, who's a clinician and clinician researcher, we gave him the role of woman with HIV or childbearing age, just to make everyone think outside of the shoes that they normally stand in, and think about how we can improve community engagement at all stages of clinical trial development. And I was looking at this figure that we put together a few years ago now, that we wrote up our findings. And I really think part 2, community engagement plan, shouldn't be part 2, it should be all along the side of this, this panel, because I think that plan needs to be all the way from the beginning, all the way through to the end. So I might have to redesign this figure, but these are a few of the strategies that we discussed in the groups, and now we're at the stage where we're really doing our best to implement these and listen to these suggestions from this workshop and bring them into fruition. So frequent and transparent communication between not just scientists and community, but also funders. Recognition of the power imbalances that lie between clinician, researcher, participant, but also our community advisory board and how much power they actually have to impact and change protocols. I think many in this room would be familiar with this concept of, yeah, CAB, have a look at this protocol. It's all written. We just need to tick of approval for the community, research ethics board, rather than actually engaging our CAB well at the beginning. So we're working on that. Utilising professional peer navigators to engage communities. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And ensuring, this is really, really important, ensuring adequate funding for community engagement is secured at the trial planning stage and at the budget writing and grant application stage. So we are starting to do better with that, but acknowledging we still need to do better in terms of funding, compensation for trial participant time, not just transport and parking costs, but also working that into our budget. This is another project funded by the Melbourne HIV Cure Consortium small grant. This was done primarily by Positive Women Victoria. This was led by our community members and supported by social researchers at La Trobe University. This was looking specifically at why women in Australia with HIV aren't, or what they want from HIV cure research. And so I'll leave you to read these points rather than reading them out, but there was a great understanding that it is important to study women. We all know there's a need, and the people that were interviewed in the study acknowledged that, and also acknowledged that there's altruism and real desire to do this, but there's a lot of barriers which affect many people with HIV, specifically women as well. And I mentioned before, our very diverse population. Many of our women come from communities where the HIV status is not known. They do not want it to be known. They won't see primary care physicians in their communities just in case they run into someone in the clinic. And so we're very mindful of that and how that would impact someone's interest and ability to come to a tertiary hospital centre or even be a face of cure research in Australia because of, one, small numbers, two, our very diverse community and the very challenging intersection of stigma and discrimination that impacts this. The group who did this project also looked at clinician perspectives, and I think this is a big issue that we're facing, I'm sure, around the world as well. Clinicians who don't work in the HIV cure space, why bother? Why do we do this? There's drugs that work, they're safe, they're not toxic. Why mess with that? Why go into these early, very small, early clinical trials looking at cancer therapies, toxicities? The amount of time it takes for a clinician who's dealing with all other kinds of things in their clinical appointment, comorbidities, fertility, for example. when do they have time to talk about research? So there's a lot of issues in the clinician aspect, but I won't go into that today, but we are working on that in our space as well. And I mentioned talking to peer navigators. This is a pilot that we did a few years ago. It was opportunistic, really. We had a workshop that I was invited to speak to our NAPWA, National Association of People with HIV Australia, Treatment Officer Network. So they're peer navigators around the country. And just fortuitously, they'd done a survey about cure research for other purposes, and we repeated that survey after the intervention, which was me talking about cure for 20 minutes. So it's a small numbers, it was a pilot, but I think it's a model that we can try and implement and use again for our peer navigators, because it's really important. They're a really important component of community engagement. I won't speak too long about this, but ongoing work is making sure we understand, as people who do volunteer and enter into these treatment interruption studies, so we understand not just why they do it, but also their fears, their concerns, their everything that we should know about treatment interruptions and people undergoing treatment interruptions. So we're trying to implement this in all our treatment interruption studies going forward. And these are a few quotes which I'll let you read in the interest of time, but this is one of our participants who was involved in the Titan study, very complex, broadly neutralizing antibody, folate receptor agonist stone study, injections weekly for 10 weeks, 2 infusions, treatment interruptions, weekly visits. A very intense study, and we also asked this person if they'd be willing to be interviewed. We interviewed all of our Australian participants of Titan, all willing, very happy to talk about their experiences. It's really important that we do this. They felt safe, which is good, really important as well. It's good feedback for us and our clinical research staff, but it's a very intense study, and it's really important that our participants feel heard, feel safe, and know that at any point their thoughts, not just for research purposes, can be heard by their researchers. Heading towards the end of my talk now, a few other things that we're trying to address. In the survey work that I mentioned earlier, we asked what might increase your willingness to participate in a treatment interruption trial. And over 50% of these were the significant ones. Home-based viral load testing. I'm still on the hunt for a point of care viral load home-based test that will give you a result straight away, similar to our COVID antigen tests. But the best I acknowledge at the moment is you can get a patch, you can get some blood taken out. You still have to post it to a lab, and you don't get instant results. So this is a thing we're trying to. If anyone knows anything, let's come up with a solution to this. PrEP, we're doing that with our protocols. Our consent processes involve a discussion around PrEP, and that's easily offered in the context of a cure trial. And then another important factor was the ability to do home visits, and so the convenience of not having to come into a clinic, particularly for some of these safety visits. Can it be done telehealth? Can it be done at home? And we did this with COVID. We kind of dropped off after the pandemic lockdown. Melbourne went through the longest lockdown in the world outside of China, I think. So we learned to do a lot of things remotely, and everyone hated it, and everyone wants to be back. But I think this is an aspect that we can learn from and should expand on, and that needs to be thought about when we're putting in funding applications for grants as well. Finally, I'll talk about what Richard asked me to talk about. I've left it to the end, which was our local volunteer database. This is just trying to think of novel ways to get people engaged in cure research, but also acknowledging that we don't want to spam people again and again with, hey, do you want to do this survey? Do you want to do this on social media or just the patients who we see in our clinic? So this was launched to try and give people the opportunity to tick a box if they wanted to be contacted about surveys, about blood donations, tissue donations, all the way up to an intervention trial with treatment interruption. So the online form allows you to put a pseudonym if you want, but just some kind of contact where we can contact you, and tick box of what you might be interested in. And the last question is, would you like to receive a 6-monthly-ish newsletter with updates on cure science, but also cure-related activities in Victoria? So this is all very local at the moment. It's just in Melbourne. And we launched it March last year. And as of last week, we've got 198 people in our database, and just a breakdown of what people have ticked. So 116 happy to be interviewed or be sent surveys, 113 willing to donate blood, tissue donations. 91, leukapheresis, which is a procedure where you sit on a machine almost like dialysis, and you filter out all the white blood cells and then give the rest back. And then 100, over 100 said they were happy to be invited into intervention studies, and all of this was explained in the online form as well. So just as we thought we'd try out this exercise and see whether this would work when recruiting people into Nivo LD, the first study I talked about, which has got a lot of tight inclusion and exclusion criteria. So, and one of the major issues is that to participate in our cure trials in Melbourne at the moment, you do have to have a Medicare card, so be eligible for that universal healthcare system. So a number of people weren't, people who signed up for this database. We have lots of students who, and that's a barrier that we need to address and figure out how we can get Medicare non-eligible people onto cure research, because cure research is for everyone. But about half were eligible, and we've contacted about half of those, and we've got response from about half of them. So this is a work in progress, but this is how we're hoping to use this this database, so we can do some targeted recruitment. We ask for a postcode as well, so we roughly know where people live, and as we expand the database and as we expand clinical sites doing cure trials in Australia, I think this will be helpful for that as well. This is look at the newsletter this is the first and only one that we sent out, and there'll be one coming after CROI, so probably some updates from this meeting and other talks on cure during the conference. This is primarily written by me, so I'm trying to get some help to do this, so that it can be more than once every 6 months, but I've engaged some of the students in my lab who are here for CROI to help with that. But it's very local specific, and I think we're trying to aim small at the grassroots to really improve that engagement locally.
Is that available to printed? Yeah.
Yes, we have provided printed copies at the Positive Living Centre, which is one of our community drop-in centres. It's probably a scope to print more and place more widely. So we have them in a few sexual health clinics as well. But it's a really important, good point. Because people can scan up and sign up for the database on the newsletter as well. And in the picture of our kind of community of HIV cure researchers in Australia, this is from our conference 2022, our National HIV/AIDS conference. We're a small but happy, friendly, collaborative group. There's clinical researchers in here, social researchers in here, people who I dragged into the photo because they were walking past. But I'm really happy and glad to be working in this space. And I think I'll end there with some pictures of beautiful Australia, if you want to come visit. Michael Scott.
I know Michael Luella online will have some as well.
Yes.
So you're talking about the women enrolling in the trials, which has always been an issue to a certain degree, greater and smaller. But one of the things with most of these trials is leukapheresis, which tends to particularly be an issue for women. Do you have that? I'm on a ACTG clinical trial team now, and we're having real problems with that because of leukapheresis. And I guess I didn't know this, but some people do with veins, and I guess just some people just don't want that. Do you have that issue?
I think we have. Thank you. Thank you. Good question. We have that issue with leukapheresis full stop. It's a big time commitment. It's about 4 hours in our machine, and we haven't run into issues with women specific, whether that be physical or vein size, because we just have so few women enrolling in our cure trials. So I'll be completely honest. I think we just have one enrolled in that Nivo LD study. The half dozen or so trials we've done leading up to this, 0 women. So it is an area that we know that we really have to work on. But no, we've not had that particular issue with whether it's vein size. But I think the time commitment has been a challenge.
Michael, do you want to have one of the participants online ask the question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we had a few questions, and where I wanted to start was these are 2 questions that were sort of related. The first question was about how deep is your reach into the Aboriginal populations of Australia in terms of your CAB and your programs? And someone else then was asking about the First Nations people, if they've been included in your research studies.
Yeah, the answer to both those questions is sadly no. So poorly represented in our CAB, not represented at all in our CAB, but also not represented in our CURE research studies. A real challenge that we have in Melbourne, specifically where I work and where a lot of the CURE activities are happening, is we do not have a large Indigenous population. This sadly stems back to historically colonisation and Indigenous people were just shifted out entirely from Melbourne. So metropolitan Melbourne has a very small Indigenous population, but are very active. And the challenge is people with HIV who identify as Indigenous or First Nations do live in the more regionally remote areas, which, first of all, bringing people in to do CURE research is geographically challenging. And once again, comes back to making sure we have funding for that, including transport costs and supports for overnight stays. But really importantly, what you've raised is having these people represented on our boards, and so there's a huge gap that we acknowledge. I haven't actually acknowledged so much in this talk, but thank you for raising that, because it is a problem that we have.
Definitely. And also we had a question from Josephine, who was interested in finding out more about how does the CAB work that you were describing? How does that relate to your consortium?
Yeah, the CAB is a work in progress, so we've just repopulated it, and we have CAB initiated activities, so that HIV CURE research for community was a CAB idea. So we have formal meetings twice a year, and I'm on the CAB as the kind of medical representative to discuss some of the science and break that down to our CAB. Our CAB is young in terms of it's just being populated, so we are starting with baby steps. Next month we have the CAB coming through my institution to look at our lab and do a bit of a meet the scientists, see what happens at the lab level, and we're working on doing that in our clinical spaces as well. And vice versa. Last year, some of our lab scientists went to the Positive Living Centre and learned a bit about what the centre does and how it supports community people with HIV in Victoria. So still early days, and I'm learning a lot from what our CAB could do from what your CABs do, and it really is open book with what we could do with our CAB. So I'm very keen to kind of learn and get ideas.
So we have another question from David Palm, which was
wait 1 second. We have one more in the room. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
Moses, and one more from Tanya as well.
So a quick one. You talked about viral-based testing in HIV CURE site. I mean, that is something I can't even see working my continent. It will need like 30 years. How are you able to introduce such a thing in your setting? Two, the fertility concern. Is it scientifically proven or is just a myth and misconception? And last concern and question was, how can one do a CURE research trial without an ATI and without a biomarker? How effectively do you get the results really without an ATI and without a biomarker?
What's the first one? I'll start from the back. How do we do CURE trial without an ATI? We don't have a reliable biomarker. That there are really impressive new assays being developed every single time I go to a conference. There's a new single cell RNA seek, this seek, that seek, which I don't spend a lot of time trying to understand. Katie might mention some of this later in her talk, but most supercharger, that is an important question. We can't at the moment. These studies do have to involve a treatment interruption because there's no reliable good biomarker that can answer this question for us. I think one's coming. There's all these fancy assays looking at very granular level what is happening with transcription and replication of virus, and if this virus is intact or not, or replication competent or not. So I think there's a lot of work in that space, but at the moment in a clinical trial we can't. fertility issues. I'm going to work backwards. Fertility issues are they're not a myth. I think they are a concern in these, all of the three that I mentioned. These are cancer, immunotherapies, and when someone does not have cancer, that risk benefit it is the risk, I believe, to an unborn baby and a developing baby is greater than the benefit of this. No clear benefit at the moment of this trial. So we know that these studies, the drugs that I'm working on in my studies, they do have concerns around pregnancy and breastfeeding, and pregnant women are specifically excluded in our studies, and in our treatment interruptions, in our protocols. If we have a woman who becomes pregnant during the study, the treatment interruption will stop. So that's written into our protocol. So I think we are not seeing enough of it to dedicate enough time, I think, personally, into this space, but it is something we need to do. At the moment, we just have long pages of protocol around discussions around contraception and the risk to fertility in consent forms. But it's not a myth. There is a safety concern with the drugs that I'm working with. And Katie will talk about some of the drugs she's working with and that as well. Let's see, what's first question?
The home-based test, which I don't
Oh,
think,
yes.
I don't think anybody wants here.
No. But so I've been doing tours of all the trade showrooms, asking who's going to invent this, who's going to invent this, because there's a need, not just in the cure space. There'd be a huge need in the treatment and prevention space as well. And the CD4 rapid point of care test does exist. So obviously the totally different science behind it, but if we can develop rapid antigen tests for COVID, and if we can measure blood sugar, and if we can do a CD4 count, which has utility in resource limited countries, because there's definitely a need there. If we want to know if someone's CD4 count's above 200 or below 200, and the same way we'd love to know if someone's viral load's above 50 or below, or even below 200, because that's where all the treatment after prevention data comes from. So I think there is a need. I just need to kind of get that need in front of the brains who can develop this test, because I think it would really change how we do cure research.
Thank you so much for answering everyone's questions. We have another one. Yeah, headed over there right now.
Great presentation, Jillian. I think something that stuck out to me was the quote or the stat that you quoted early on in your presentation about Australia being a majority country of people born overseas. Can you expound on that a little bit and then tie that into how ethnic or racial diversity is represented in the epidemic and how that translates or not into the folks who are represented in your studies? So walk me through diversity across the continuum on how people are represented as people living with HIV, and then represented as diverse groups of folks or not in your research studies.
Thanks, Daniel. Really important question. Really thought-provoking for me, I guess. So yes, diverse, very diverse country. Breakdown, mainly older, I would say, European migrants post World War II, and then more recently after the Vietnam War, a lot of Southeast Asian migrants, and then economic migrants from Southeast Asia and East Asia as well. So we also have, I don't know the numbers specifically, but sub-Saharan African migrants as well from various backgrounds. Some through refugee processes and asylum seeking processes, and others through skilled migration. So short story, very diverse, colourful country. How it's represented in the HIV epidemic in Australia. The new diagnoses we're definitely seeing drop. Unfortunately, this is in Caucasian men who have sex with men. We're seeing an increase, or at least 2 years ago, there was an increase in new diagnoses of gay and bisexual men who identify as gay and bisexual men, born overseas, particularly our students from Southeast Asia. So this is an area in the prevention and diagnosis sector that we really need to work on. in trials, cure trials, a lot of Caucasian middle-aged men is what we've had so far, and that's because of the primary clinical center where we were recruiting for this trial had a lot of that population, and so in the last 2 years we've really worked on trying to increase clinical sites to do these trials. 2 of the places that we're adding on this year have their population is 30% women as opposed to 5 in that other center. And one of the hospitals we're trying to bring on board have, people from born in 60 different countries in our HIV clinic. So that number is much smaller than the other center, which has 2,000 people. This place has 400 people. It's much more diverse, much more skewed towards, global demographics of people with HIV as opposed to demographics in metropolitan Melbourne and that area of Sydney, which is virtually eliminated HIV. That's a very Caucasian male population as well. So I think we just need to be more careful with that.
Well, yes, mine is what a card. I think cure research is not unique. We've had prevention and treatment studies before. What I've observed over the years is the fact that some CABs are developed just to tick the box. They are not empowered, and their contribution is minimal. It's limited. Just because maybe the child has to go through. What do you think we should begin to do to promote empowerment of CAB members so that they meaningfully contribute to the process of the research? I'm saying this because I'm in a city where the Denver principles were created. Thank you.
Okay, running this up, I think of course we can throw back to the room at the end of the discussions.
Yeah, a really, really good question.
Michael, did you need us to repeat that question?
Yes, it's really hard for any of the questions and all of the questions, at least give us a summary of what's being talked about. It's really hard to hear when people have the microphone. The speakers are fine. It's the other people who we can't hear very well. We just hear a mumbling.
Excellent. I'm sorry. I apologize. We will be
No
better
worries.
going forward. This most recent one is that CABs are often engaged in such a way that they are just there to tick off a box. And his question is, in what ways can CABs be empowered to actually have some control over trials and what goes on?
Good question.
A really good question. And not so much our CAB, but the Inspire workshop, this was a recurring theme. What is the power of CABs? You've given us a protocol, it's basically ready to go. We've had no input into this until this point. So how do we shift and change that? And the good thing about our HIV cure CAB is we've just repopulated it and we're starting from scratch essentially. And we get to try and navigate those things together with our CAB. So asking our CAB, how does this work? What would you like? Something I'm trying to do personally, which so once again, working from the ground up and take a long time for this to catch on, I think, is that I'm budgeting community time into my budgets now. And I've worked with NAPWA to ask how much is that time worth and how much input. And then I'm paying that time. And so that's N=1 with me. But I'm trying to do that with every trial I'm involved with going forward, which is most of the cure trials in Melbourne. And then we can move on and on. But I think funding our CAB and funding people's time and respecting their time in the CAB is really important. But I hear you, and we've heard as well from our community in Australia that this very much feels like a tick box exercise. Where is the steering committee at the beginning of the trial, or even where is the CAB dictating what needs to be studied? That's not happening at all in Australia. That's quite different here in the States, but I think it's a really good question to throw out later.
Thank you for coming.